Late evening shadows stretched across the quiet highway. The hum of passing cars was low and steady, like the rhythm of the night itself. On this road, headlights cut through the darkness and the cool air carried a sense of calm. Among those cars, a black SUV glided smoothly down the lane. Behind the wheel sat David Carter, a well-dressed man in his mid-40s, calm and composed. He had spent the day attending important meetings and now he was simply heading home. His focus was on the road, the radio playing softly, his mind already shifting to rest and family. A few cars back, Officer Mark Reynolds sat in his patrol cruiser. He had been on duty for hours, restless and alert, scanning every vehicle that passed. When his eyes caught sight of David's SUV, sleek and spotless, his attention sharpened. Something about the driver, his suit, his calm expression, his presence stirred something in Reynolds. Doubt mixed with arrogance. He wondered, what's a man like that doing here at this hour? Instead of considering that David was simply a professional on his way home, Reynolds jumped to conclusions. His hand tapped the wheel impatiently as suspicion clouded his judgment. With a quick motion, Reynolds flicked on his flashing lights. The red and blue glow lit up the dark stretch of road, reflecting on the SUV ahead. David noticed immediately and slowed down, pulling smoothly onto the shoulder. He didn't panic. He had nothing to hide. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay composed. Encounters like this were not new to him, though each time carried its own weight. He carefully turned down the radio, switched on the interior light, and placed both hands clearly on the steering wheel. Every action was deliberate, meant to show he had nothing to conceal. Reynolds stepped out of his cruiser, his boots crunching on the gravel. His hand rested firmly on his holstered weapon as he approached, eyes narrowed and voice already harsh. "License and registration," he barked without even greeting. David nodded politely, his voice steady. "Of course, officer. Everything is in order." He reached slowly for his wallet, then the glove compartment, moving carefully so there would be no misunderstanding. He handed over the documents with calm precision. Reynolds snatched them, glancing quickly but barely reading the details. His mind was already set. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded. His tone carried no respect, only suspicion. David looked at him, surprised by the escalation. "Officer, is there a reason for this stop?" he asked, still calm. But Reynolds had already placed his hand on his weapon, pulling it out halfway. The sight of the gun glinting under the flashing lights created a tense silence. "I said step out," Reynolds shouted. David's heart remained steady, though he felt the familiar sting of injustice. He opened the door slowly and stepped out, his suit jacket catching the glow of the lights. His posture was straight, his movements careful. Around them a few cars slowed, drivers curious at the scene. Some pulled over, watching from a safe distance. A couple of bystanders took out their phones, recording quietly. The weight of their cameras added another layer to the moment. Reynolds, gun drawn now, aimed it toward David as if expecting danger. "Hands where I can see them," he yelled. David raised his hands calmly, his expression still composed. The officer's aggression contrasted sharply with the man's quiet dignity. The tension was thick enough to cut through, and the gathered onlookers felt it. Some whispered, others gasped. To them, it looked like a man being treated as a criminal without cause. David, however, didn't lose control. His voice was steady, clear, and firm. "Officer, you are making a mistake," he said, eyes locked on Reynolds. The officer sneered, shaking his head. "We'll see about that. People like you think you can drive fancy cars and act like you belong here." His words were sharp, his prejudice slipping through, but David did not react with anger. He knew reacting would only give Reynolds an excuse. Instead, he stood with quiet strength, letting the silence expose the officer's bias. The seconds felt longer than minutes. Every small sound, the hum of passing cars, the crunch of Reynolds's boots, the distant chirp of insects, seemed louder in the stillness. David's calmness began to unsettle Reynolds, though he didn't show it. He wanted control, yet he felt it slipping. He barked into his radio, calling for backup as if the man before him was a threat. "Possible suspect," Reynolds muttered, though there was no crime, no evidence. Nothing but his own suspicion. David lowered his voice slightly, almost as if speaking to himself, but loud enough for Reynolds to hear. "This will not end the way you expect." The words carried weight, steady and certain. They were not shouted, not meant to provoke, but they lingered in the air. Reynolds frowned, unsure how to interpret them. Around them, the small crowd continued to grow, More phones lifted, more eyes fixed on the scene. People sensed something unusual was unfolding, though they didn't yet know how extraordinary it would become. David stood tall, unflinching, as the flashing lights painted the night in red and blue. His calmness was more powerful than any shout could be. He wasn't just protecting himself. He was silently building a moment that would soon reveal who he truly was. And as Reynolds tightened his grip on the weapon, convinced he was in control, he had no idea that the ground beneath him was already shifting, that the man before him was about to change the story in a way that would leave everyone, especially the officer, stunned. The tension in the air grew heavier with every passing second. The flashing red and blue lights bounced across the dark road, casting long shadows on the bystanders who stood silently with their phones lifted. The low hum of traffic passing in the distance added to the atmosphere, but here on the shoulder of the highway everything felt frozen. David Carter stood calmly beside his SUV, his hands raised, his face composed. His calmness was not weakness, it was strength, quiet and unshakable. Yet Officer Reynolds only grew louder, mistaking David's restraint for defiance. "Don't move a muscle," Reynolds barked, his voice echoing across the road. He paced slightly, his weapon still aimed forward. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his nerves feeding his aggression. In his mind, he convinced himself he was in control, though deep inside, doubt had already begun to stir. He could not understand why David wasn't panicking, why he wasn't pleading or trembling. Instead, David's silence seemed to challenge everything Reynolds believed about power and control. A small crowd was now gathered. A young couple who had been driving home from dinner had pulled over, unable to look away. An older man stood near his car, recording every moment with steady hands. A group of teenagers, their faces lit by the glow of their phone screens, whispered to each other, shocked by what they were witnessing. Their whispers carried disbelief. He didn't even do anything. Why is the cop yelling like that? Look at the man. He's calm, he's not resisting. These murmurs floated in the air, though Reynolds pretended not to hear them. He focused on keeping the spotlight on David, determined to prove he was right. David finally spoke, his voice low but clear enough for all to hear. "Officer, I have complied with everything you've asked. I have shown you my documents. I have stepped out of the vehicle. I am unarmed. Why are you escalating this?" His words were not emotional. They were measured, logical. They carried a weight that only truth could. But Reynolds, instead of calming down, grew harsher. "You think you can tell me how to do my job?" he snapped, glaring with narrowed eyes. "People like you are always hiding something." Those words made the bystanders stir uncomfortably. The bias in his tone was obvious, and the cameras kept recording. David remained steady. He didn't flinch. He simply looked Reynolds in the eyes, his gaze unwavering, as if silently reminding him that truth always outlives lies. That silent exchange, simple yet powerful, made Reynolds' pulse quicken. He felt as though he was being judged, but not by David, by something greater, something unseen. Backup arrived. Another patrol car pulled up, lights flashing, sirens briefly cutting through the night before fading into silence. Two more officers stepped out, cautious but curious. They quickly noticed the unusual atmosphere. One man standing calmly in a suit, his SUV parked neatly, and another officer shouting, gun drawn, as if facing a dangerous criminal. The second pair of officers exchanged glances, uneasy with the scene. Still, protocol urged them to side with their fellow officer, at least outwardly. They positioned themselves at the edge, watching, waiting. David's calm voice broke the silence again. "Officer, you are escalating something that should have been a simple stop. You are making choices that you may regret." His tone was neither threatening nor fearful. It was steady, like a man stating facts. The bystanders leaned in, sensing something important was coming. Reynolds, unsettled by the man's composure, scoffed. "And what are you going to do? Call a lawyer?" His sarcasm dripped with arrogance. David did not argue. Instead, he lowered his hands slowly, deliberately, and reached into his pocket. The motion made the officers tense, but David moved carefully, showing them clearly that he was reaching for a phone. He pulled it out and held it in his hand, the screen glowing softly in the night. Reynolds barked again, "Put that down! You're not making calls while we sort this out." But David ignored the command. He unlocked his phone with a calm swipe and pressed a number without hesitation. The crowd grew hushed. Every eye was fixed on the man with the phone, every ear strained to catch his words. The air was thick with suspense. The officers shifted uneasily as David lifted the phone to his ear. Within seconds, a voice answered. David's tone shifted ever so slightly. Calm, yes, but firm, professional, and commanding. "This is Carter. Connect me to the Pentagon immediately." His words cut through the silence like a blade. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even the backup officers stiffened, unsure they had heard correctly. Reynolds blinked, his confidence faltering for the first time. He had expected excuses, pleas, maybe even anger, but not this. Not a direct call to the highest levels of authority. David waited patiently, the phone pressed to his ear. His expression didn't change, but his presence seemed to grow larger, more commanding. The crowd sensed it. The backup officers sensed it. And Reynolds, though he tried to mask it, felt a chill of fear crawl up his spine. David spoke again, his words deliberate, calm, but sharp with authority. "Yes, this is David Carter. Verification code Alpha Delta 7. The line was quiet for a moment, then filled with the sound of an operator confirming his credentials. The crowd was too far to hear the details, but they understood the gravity of the exchange. This was no ordinary man. His voice carried the weight of someone who belonged in rooms of power, someone who spoke with decision-makers at the highest level. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that the balance of power had shifted completely. Reynolds' hands trembled slightly, though he kept his weapon raised. He didn't understand what was happening. "What is this? Some kind of trick?" he muttered under his breath, his voice no longer as strong, but the doubt in his eyes betrayed him. The backup officers looked at each other, questions rising silently between them. The crowd leaned in, recording every second, knowing they were witnessing something far greater than a simple traffic stop. David continued calmly. "Yes, I'm currently being detained unlawfully on Route 17, near mile marker 43. Officer Reynolds. Yes, that's correct. I will remain on the line." He spoke not like a man begging for help, but like one reporting a matter of importance. His tone was professional, businesslike, and precise. He was not pleading, he was documenting. And the Pentagon, hundreds of miles away, was listening. For Reynolds, the moment felt unreal. The man he had pulled over so confidently, so arrogantly, was now revealing a truth he could never have imagined. He had expected submission, but instead he was faced with calm authority connected to a power far beyond his reach. His pulse quickened, his mouth went dry, and for the first time that night he realized he might not be the one in control after all. The bystanders exchanged looks of shock, their cameras capturing every second. They knew this was no ordinary stop. Something historic was unfolding before their eyes. And as David stood there, phone to his ear, unwavering, composed, the world around him seemed to pause. Every breath, every glance, every whisper carried the weight of anticipation. The cop who had tried to break him was now the one trembling inside, and everyone watching could feel it. The road was silent except for the hum of the flashing patrol lights and the faint murmur of the gathered crowd. David stood tall, phone pressed to his ear, his calm demeanor unbroken. The man who had been treated like a criminal now spoke words that carried weight far beyond this highway. His tone was steady, measured, filled with quiet authority. He was not just calling for help. He was calling to report an abuse of power directly to a place most people could only imagine reaching. "Confirmed," the voice on the other end replied after a pause. "Mr. Carter, your identity is verified. Hold the line." The operator's voice was crisp, professional. Those nearby couldn't hear the exact words, but they could sense from David's expression that the call was serious. His eyes remained fixed ahead, calm yet firm, as though he had done this many times before. Officer Reynolds shifted uneasily, sweat gathering at his brow. His gun was still drawn, but his hands trembled slightly. The authority he once thought he held was slipping away with every second of David's call. The backup officers exchanged glances, their earlier certainty faltering. They had come expecting to support a routine stop, yet here they were, watching a man converse with the Pentagon as though it were as normal as calling a friend. David spoke again, his voice deliberate and professional. "Yes, I am currently being held at gunpoint by Officer Mark Reynolds of the local police department. I have complied with all commands. My documents are in order. This incident must be logged immediately." His words were clear, not spoken for drama, but as a precise report to the highest authority. The crowd stirred, realizing the seriousness of the situation. A young man whispered, Did he just say Pentagon? Like the actual Pentagon? His friend nodded, eyes wide, recording with a shaking hand. An older woman muttered under her breath, "Lord have mercy, this officer doesn't even know who he's dealing with." The bystanders felt the weight of history in the making. They were witnessing something extraordinary, something they would tell others about for years to come. Reynolds tried to reassert control. "Put that phone down!" he barked, though his voice cracked with uncertainty. His authority was slipping and he knew it. David turned his head slowly, meeting the officer's eyes. "I will not put the phone down. You have overstepped, and now others are aware of it." His words carried a calm finality. There was no anger in his voice, no fear, just truth. That truth made Reynolds flinch more than any shout could. Moments later, David's phone buzzed as the line transferred. A deeper voice came through, steady and commanding. "Mr. Carter, this is General Matthews. We've been informed of your situation. Are you safe?" The sound of that name alone, General Matthews, was enough to make the backup officers freeze. They recognized it. Anyone who followed national news would know the name of a top Pentagon official. David responded firmly, "Yes, General. I am safe for now, but I am being detained unlawfully. There are multiple witnesses and recordings. The officer has drawn his weapon without justification." His tone was respectful but direct, like a man accustomed to briefing leaders. The crowd couldn't hear the words on the other end, but they could see the change in David's stance and the shift in the officer's expressions. The man who moments ago had been treated as a suspect now stood revealed as someone with immense influence. The backup officers began to lower their hands from their holsters, unsure of where this was going. Even they felt the pull of authority in David's voice. Reynolds, however, clung to what little power he thought he had. "This is nonsense," he muttered, though the tremble in his voice betrayed him. "You're just making this up to scare me." But deep inside he knew it wasn't true. The way David spoke, the quick verification, the name of the general, all of it was real. And the cameras were catching every second of his unraveling. David nodded as he listened to the voice on the line. "Yes, General, I understand. Please ensure this is documented. I will remain calm.
I will allow the local authorities to correct their mistake.
But I want this entered into record." His words revealed something important. He wasn't just a man with powerful contacts. He was a man trusted by the Pentagon itself, someone whose calls were answered immediately by leaders of the nation's defense. The crowd gasped again as David spoke in short, clipped codes and references that only those in the defense world would understand. He mentioned Protocol Alpha, field verification, and incident chain reporting. To ordinary ears, the terms meant little, but the way he used them showed knowledge that few could possess. The backup officers looked uneasy now, their eyes flicking between Reynolds and David. They began to wonder if they had just walked into a situation that could end their own careers. Reynolds's arrogance wavered further. His grip on his weapon loosened, though he didn't lower it completely. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but none came. His words grew quieter, less confident. I don't know what game you're playing here." But everyone present could see it wasn't a game. It was real, and Reynolds was losing control. David ended the call respectfully. "Thank you, General. I'll handle it from here. Good night." He slipped the phone back into his pocket with the same calmness he had shown from the beginning. Then he looked around at the crowd, at the backup officers, and finally back at Reynolds. His presence was undeniable now. He wasn't a victim. He was a man of stature, of power, of unshakable dignity. The crowd broke into quiet murmurs, astonished by what they had just witnessed. "He really called the Pentagon," one bystander whispered. "Did you hear the name? That was a general." Another added, "That officer's career is finished." Phones continued recording, capturing not only the events but also the disbelief etched on every face. David took a slow step forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Officer Reynolds, you have drawn your weapon on an innocent man. You have humiliated yourself in front of your peers, your community, and now the nation. Because make no mistake, this moment will not stay hidden. It is already recorded, already documented." Reynolds's face turned pale. His gun, once held with false confidence, now trembled in his hands. He realized that the man standing before him wasn't just a driver in a suit. He was someone who had the power to end his career with a single call. He had picked the wrong man to target, and now the whole world was watching his downfall unfold. As the night deepened, the atmosphere shifted completely. David, once treated as a suspect, now stood as a symbol of dignity and quiet strength. The power had changed hands without violence, without shouting, only through truth, calmness, and the undeniable weight of his identity. The cop who thought he held control was left shaken, while everyone else understood they had witnessed a moment they would never forget. The night air on the quiet highway felt charged with electricity, as though every heartbeat, every whisper, every footstep could change the outcome of what was unfolding. David Carter stood calmly beside his black SUV, his phone now safely tucked away after the tense but decisive call to the Pentagon. His presence had shifted the balance of power completely. Where moments ago Officer Reynolds had thought himself in control, now he stood exposed, unsure of his next move, while the crowd and backup officers sensed that something extraordinary was happening. The minutes stretched, and then the unmistakable sound of sirens broke the tension, not from police backup, but from official government vehicles speeding toward the scene. A sleek, unmarked SUV pulled onto the shoulder, and from it stepped armed personnel in crisp uniforms, their movements precise and confident. Each step they took radiated authority, and instantly the crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. The backup officers shifted nervously, realizing that these were not ordinary law enforcement officials. They were here because David Carter was someone of significant importance. David turned slightly to face the approaching personnel. His expression remained calm, but his eyes reflected a quiet command. There was no panic, no unnecessary movement, only a measured and deliberate demeanor. Reynolds, by contrast, grew visibly tense, the sweat on his forehead glinting in the flashing lights. The weight of what he had done began to sink in. The realization that his biased actions, his rash judgment, and his escalation of force had placed him in a situation far beyond his control. As the armed personnel approached, one of them spoke into a radio, confirming David's identity and credentials. The words, though not all audible to the bystanders, carried weight. The backup officers could hear snippets. Top-level clearance confirmed, Pentagon advisory, authorized engagement, and the significance hit them immediately. Reynolds' hands shook slightly on his weapon. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a dawning sense of fear and regret. David nodded politely to the officials as they reached him, answering any questions they asked with calm, concise responses. He explained what had happened, describing each moment of the stop, Reynolds' behavior, and his own measured actions. The officials listened carefully, their expressions serious. They were here not only to ensure David's safety, but also to assess the situation and document every detail. Their presence alone sent a message to everyone around. This man, David Carter, was not to be underestimated. Reynolds tried to regain some sense of authority, though his voice was quieter now, less certain. I was just doing my job, he stammered. But his words fell flat. The officials ignored his attempt to justify himself, focusing instead on securing the scene and ensuring David's safety. The crowd, meanwhile, watched in stunned silence. Phones continued recording, capturing every gesture, every expression, every exchange. They understood that history was being made right before their eyes. David's composure never wavered. He did not shout, he did not panic, he did not berate Reynolds. Instead, he let the presence of the Pentagon officials, his calm authority, and the undeniable truth of his identity speak for him. The officers and bystanders could see clearly. This man was someone whose word and actions carried weight at the highest levels of government. Reynolds, once brimming with confidence, now seemed small and powerless by comparison. One of the Pentagon officials stepped closer to Reynolds, a stern look in their eyes. "Officer Reynolds," they said in a firm, commanding voice, "you have drawn your weapon on an individual without cause. This incident will be fully documented, and your actions reviewed." The words were clear, unyielding, and carried the authority of the highest offices. Reynolds felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. Every instinct told him that his career, and perhaps more, was in jeopardy. David, meanwhile, remained courteous yet firm. He spoke to the officials in professional terms, outlining what had occurred, noting every witness, and detailing the escalating tension. He mentioned the bystanders recording the scene and emphasized the need for accuracy and transparency. His voice carried not a hint of anger, but a clear expectation that the situation be corrected. To anyone watching, It was evident that he was not just a victim of an overzealous officer. He was a man who commanded respect and action. The crowd's whispers grew louder as the situation became fully clear. "That's the Pentagon? He's calling generals?" one young woman murmured to her friend. "Look at the officer, he looks terrified," another said. Their phones continued capturing every second, the story spreading in real time across social media. Even from a distance, one could feel the power dynamics shifting. Reynolds, for the first time in his career, experienced a moment of true vulnerability. The realization that his arrogance and prejudice had led him into a situation beyond his control weighed heavily on him. David's calm demeanor, the authority of the Pentagon officials, and the presence of multiple witnesses created a scene that could not be ignored or misrepresented. He did not need to raise his voice or threaten. The facts, the evidence, and his composure were enough to expose the truth. Reynolds' attempts at control were futile. His grip on his weapon loosened as he faced the reality that the moment had passed him by. The man he had attempted to intimidate was, in fact, untouchable in this context. The Pentagon personnel carefully escorted David back to his SUV, ensuring he was completely safe. Every movement was precise, professional, and commanding. Reynolds remained on the shoulder, flanked by the backup officers, his pride shattered, his authority undermined. The bystanders continued to record, their excitement and disbelief growing. "I can't believe what I just saw," one whispered. He didn't even raise his voice. "And now the military is here." As David returned to his vehicle, he nodded politely to the officers and Pentagon personnel. His expression was calm, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos and tension that had consumed the road minutes earlier. He slid into the driver's seat, ready to leave, but he paused for a moment, looking at Reynolds. There was no anger in his gaze, no revenge in his posture, only the quiet power of a man who had been wronged and had ensured the wrong was corrected. Reynolds lowered his weapon completely, his hands still shaking. The realization of what had just occurred pressed down on him. He had attempted to assert authority through intimidation and bias, only to be confronted with the undeniable truth of David Carter's identity and influence. The crowd dispersed slowly, still murmuring in disbelief, their recordings spreading the story further than anyone could have imagined. David started his SUV and drove away, the flashing lights of the government vehicles following briefly to ensure his safety. The night had changed. A routine traffic stop had become a powerful lesson in justice, respect, and the consequences of prejudice. Officer Reynolds was left on the side of the road, forced to confront the weight of his actions. The crowd, though dispersed, carried the story with them, knowing they had witnessed an extraordinary moment of dignity, authority, and truth prevailing over arrogance and bias. The highway returned slowly to its quiet rhythm as the flashing lights of the government vehicles faded into the distance. David Carter had driven off, calm and composed, leaving behind a scene that would linger in memory for everyone who had witnessed it. The crowd that had gathered slowly dispersed, their whispers and excited chatter filling the air as they replayed the events in their minds. Every person there knew they had seen something extraordinary, a man treated like a suspect who revealed an authority far beyond what anyone could have imagined. "Officer." Reynolds remained on the shoulder of the highway, his hands still shaking slightly, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the evening pressed down on him. For the first time he realized that arrogance and prejudice could be dangerous, not only to others but to himself. Every decision he had made in the past hour, the assumptions, the threats, the gun drawn, had led him into a situation he could not control. The sight of David speaking calmly on the phone to Pentagon officials, his words precise and commanding, had shattered every illusion Reynolds had about power. The backup officers, though not directly involved in the initial stop, felt the gravity of the situation as well. They had witnessed their colleagues' misjudgment and the swift shift in authority. Their own actions would be reviewed, though they were not the primary officers involved. The recordings captured by bystanders added another layer to the story, documenting each moment for the world to see. The officers understood that this incident would not remain local. It would travel through news outlets, social media, and official channels reaching far beyond their small town. A few minutes later, the police chief arrived at the scene, his face grave. He had been informed immediately and came to address the situation personally. He walked toward Reynolds, who stood rigid, unable to meet the chief's eyes. "Mark," the chief said, his voice calm but serious. "I understand what happened here. We have received full documentation and multiple witness statements. This is a very serious matter. I need you to cooperate fully with the investigation." Reynolds nodded slowly, words failing him. He knew there was no defense that could fully erase what had occurred. Meanwhile, David Carter's actions became the topic of conversation among the bystanders and officers alike. He had not raised his voice, he had not threatened anyone. Yet his calm demeanor and authority had shifted the entire scenario. The Pentagon's involvement confirmed the truth. David was a man of influence, someone trusted with significant responsibility. The bystanders replayed the moments in their minds, amazed at how a situation that could have escalated into violence had been diffused with composure and truth. As the crowd dwindled, whispers continued to spread. "That man didn't even yell, he just handled it," one observer said. Another added, "And now the officer is going to be investigated." "I've never seen anything like this." Every person who had recorded the event understood that what they had captured was more than just a routine stop. It was a lesson in respect, authority, and the power of calmness under pressure. Back at the scene, Pentagon officials contacted local authorities to ensure the investigation would proceed fairly. They emphasized that the actions of Officer Reynolds were unacceptable and that steps must be taken to prevent such incidents in the future. The documentation from David Carter's call provided a clear record of the events, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Reynolds was now fully aware that his decisions could lead to the loss of his badge, his career, and his reputation. The officers around him silently observed, the lesson clear to them as well. David's SUV disappeared into the night, leaving only the memory of his calm authority. The message was unmistakable. Prejudice and assumption could be dangerous, but truth, composure, and integrity held immense power. Reynolds, left on the shoulder of the highway, felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He could not ignore the lesson. He had acted without understanding, without fairness, and he had been humbled in the most public and undeniable way possible. As the investigation began, Reynolds faced questions from his superiors, each one more pointed than the last. He realized that every decision made in haste, every biased assumption, and every misuse of authority could carry serious consequences. Meanwhile, the backup officers gave their statements honestly, reflecting on what they had witnessed and acknowledging the impact of David's presence and composure. The bystanders' videos and recordings circulated online, bringing national attention to the event. David Carter's calm, authoritative response became a symbol for many, a reminder that dignity and courage could command respect even in the most threatening circumstances. In the days that followed, news outlets picked up the story. Headlines praised David Carter's composure, his quick thinking, and his ability to maintain authority under pressure. Analysts discussed the incident as a powerful example of how calm intelligence could overcome arrogance and bias. Officer Reynolds' story became a cautionary tale. He was formally reprimanded, his career reviewed, and he faced mandatory retraining and accountability measures. The public discussion focused on fairness, respect, and the consequences of prejudice. David, meanwhile, returned to his life without fanfare. He did not boast or seek attention for his actions. His phone rang occasionally with messages of appreciation and curiosity, but he responded with the same calm professionalism he had demonstrated on the highway. For him, the incident was a matter of principle, a demonstration that truth, integrity, and composure could triumph over fear and prejudice. He continued his work advising at the highest levels, trusted and respected, while the lessons from that night lived on in the memories of those who had witnessed it. The final image of the night remained vivid in everyone's mind, the contrast of calm authority against arrogance and bias, the realization that power comes not from weapons or threats, but from integrity, knowledge, and composure. Reynolds learned this lesson in the most direct way possible, while the world watched and remembered. In the end, it was not the gun or the flashing lights that held the power. It was the quiet strength of a man who stood firm in the face of prejudice, proving that dignity and truth would always prevail. The story concluded with a sense of resolution. The officers involved would carry the lesson for the rest of their careers. The bystanders would share the story, reminding others of the dangers of assumption and the importance of fairness, and David Carter, without fanfare or ceremony, continued on his path. a living example that courage and calmness could change the outcome of even the most tense and dangerous situations.